Hi, everyone. My name is Blair Kaneshiro. I'm currently affiliated with Stanford University, and I'm really excited to be speaking to all of you today about music cognition and neuroscience. So thank you so much for the invitation. Before I go into my talk, I thought I would tell you a little bit about me. My educational path and background actually started with music. So I was a music major at Stanford for my undergrad. I later went back to Stanford for graduate school, and I did a master's degree and also my PhD in the music technology side of the music department at Stanford. Along the way, I also picked up a master's degree in electrical engineering while I was completing the PhD. After my PhD, I was still at Stanford, and I did a postdoc that was a cross between music and an independent research center at Stanford called the Center for the Study of Language and Information. And after that, I was a research scientist for a year in the otolaryngology department in Stanford School of Medicine. I also have some industry experience. So while I was in graduate school, I worked at Shazam for a number of years. And I also briefly worked at another music company in the Bay Area called Smule. And today, I'm continuing my tour around Stanford. So I am primarily based in the Stanford Graduate School of Education now, where I am a staff researcher, and I also have an adjunct professor appointment at the Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics at Stanford. But actually today I am zooming into all of you, or into you, like from Alaska, actually. So I've actually relocated to my home state of Alaska, and I'm living in Anchorage, where I also have an adjunct appointment at University of Alaska Anchorage in the College of Engineering. So that's kind of where I've been in my schooling and afterwards. And for my research, I work kind of at the intersection of, you can think of it as a Venn diagram between music and neuroscience. So I work in both areas. The areas often, but not always intersect. So I do have some neuroscience research that isn't about music. And I also have some music research that's not about neuroscience. And that's kind of another area that I work in that has to do more with like user research and how people engage with technology for things that are related to music. So that's me. And I was really excited to be approached by your group. I think you found me through my affiliation with the Music Engagement Research Initiative, or MARY, at Stanford. And here's, we have a website, and it's a pretty broad topic that the group is looking at. So it really is about musical engagement, the how and why of it. And we have several approaches that we take to study this topic. So one approach is what I'll be talking about today, which is neuroscience research on musical engagement. But we also do user research, as I mentioned. We also have people in the group who are looking at how do you study or synthesize vocal expression in both music and speech. And then there's also some research going on architectural or virtual acoustics. So when you're in a space that has properties that impact your experience of sound, how do you model that? Or how do you actually simulate that? So for instance, like how would you simulate being in a very spacious cathedral or something just through your headphones? So that's the research group. My approach for research involves electroencephalography, or EEG. And what this is a measure of the electrical activity for the brain. So you may have seen systems like this where there are a number of sensors that sit on the surface of the head. And then each sensor is basically recording a time series of data that we can then analyze. So EEG has its advantages and disadvantages. like any neuroimaging approach. So on the plus side, it has really good temporal resolution. So it's great if you want to look at things, like on the order of milliseconds that they happen, which is good for things like music, which, is a time-based stimulus. It's also non-invasive, so you don't need to implant anything. It's a pretty easy system to take on and take off. It's also an easy system to move around. So while we would ask this participant, for instance, to stay still, it's still a relatively lightweight setup. And so it's not like a giant machine that needs to be installed in a room and stay there forever. It also has a large field of view. So what that means is you can see that the electrodes are covering like the whole surface of the back of the head. And so that allows us to capture and record brain activity, across different areas, as opposed to an approach where you might be hyper-focused on a single brain area. And finally, it's relatively low cost. So as you may know, most neuroimaging equipment is kind of expensive, but as far as systems go, EEG is thought to be, on the lower end of operating cost, and that facilitates its wide adoption. So there's a very large community of researchers who are working in EEG, which makes it a very robust and lively field of research. On the other hand, there are some drawbacks. So what we get in time, we do kind of give up in space. So it is challenging if you're looking for a specific brain area in your research. And the data are very noisy. So you are recording brain signals, but they're often buried in a lot of noise. So it can be hard to get to. So given that, I'm trying to put together kind of, the research group focus on engagement using EEG as a methodology. And so we're trying to ask questions specifically about a state of focused engagement during music listening. So musical engagement can mean many things, but we're really interested in this definition when it comes to the neuroscience research. So it's all about kind of, having that anticipatory interest in the music. And from a music researcher's perspective, this topic can involve, a lot of things about music and also about the listener. So you might look at things from a compositional perspective. So what did the composer do that they thought would draw in the listener at different points in a piece? You might want to look at the listener, right? So how does your mood when you listen to music impact how you engage with it, or whether you have specialized training in a type of music, or even whether you prefer the music in general. And then there's also questions about context. So sometimes people listen to music as the main activity, but oftentimes music is used as a background to other activities or to even support activities. So exercise would be one example of that. And so how does that context also affect the way that people engage with music? And is there ever going to be a way for us to measure that using neuroscience? So that's kind of the challenge that we came up against as we were getting into this topic. And one challenge involves kind of the typical ways of doing neuroscience research, where you often have these stimuli that are very tightly controlled. They're often not similar to music that you would listen to in real life. And you also often have to present a stimulus many, many times. So because of the noise in the data, a lot of times in EEG research, people will present the same stimulus like 10 times or maybe 100 times. There are some paradigms where you need someone to hear it thousands of times, and then you take all of those responses and average them, and what's left is the brain response of interest. And that's really the opposite of what we want to do. So, we want to work with real world music, so things that you would actually choose to listen to in real life. We want to play you the whole piece, and we want you to only have to hear it one time. And so this did not seem possible at the the onset of our research. But it turns out that by kind of taking a broader view of music neuroscience and going more in the engineering direction, we can actually adopt some emerging methods to study music processing in the way that we really want to. And so our research is based on a technique that's come out about a decade ago that shows that when an audience is engaged with a stimulus, their brain responses will actually synchronize with one another. And this is called intersubject correlation, or ISC. And what it is, it really is just the correlation among different trials of data to a given stimulus. And it's been shown to index this brain state of engagement, which is, again, kind of a challenging term to pin down, but you can think of it as attention, but with that sense of anticipation loaded onto it. And so to do this kind of research, you have every participant experience the same stimulus. It's okay if they come in one at a time, since most labs have one EEG system. And the stimulus can be a complex, uncontrolled stimulus. So researchers have used things like film clips. They've used the premiere episode of The Walking Dead. We like to use full-length songs from different genres. And the really great thing is that you only need to present the stimulus one time to each participant. So you're really getting closer to the real world experience of a work. And under the hood, it's a very simple kind of experiment paradigm. And it's in the analysis that we kind of do the heavy lifting. So for our analysis, we are leveraging these new techniques that come more out of like biomedical engineering and electrical engineering in order to really pull that signal out of these noisy, like single EEG trials. And the methods that we use involve a lot of matrix factorization and signal processing, also some new ways of thinking about statistics. So if any of you are taking like linear algebra, for instance, and like wondering why are you doing this and like why would it ever be useful, actually almost everything that I do in neuroscience is linear algebra. So I promise like there is a use for linear algebra at some point in the future. And so if you're interested, this is the paper that first introduced the method that we're looking at. It's actually not a music paper. They were using movie excerpts. Just little content warning, I'm going to show an image of a firearm in the next 2 slides. But they were using as one of their stimuli, this Alfred Hitchcock film that was a little vignette of a child who was playing with a gun. And basically what they did is they had a set of participants watch the movie, and then they did this intersubject correlation analysis. And this is one of the results. So we have here time on the x-axis. So this was about a 6-minute stimulus. And then we have this correlation measure on the y-axis. And when the correlation goes above the shaded gray area, that would be like a statistically significant correlation that we're interested in. And so the researchers found that, when the correlation was quite high, it was corresponding to these very suspenseful points during the movie excerpt. And you might be wondering like, well, maybe that was just because it was, these images are pretty evocative. But it turns out that when they showed people a scrambled version of the stimulus, the correlation actually went away. And so they were able to conclude that it really is due to this like narrative, like kind of engagement that comes when you have a story that is eliciting things like tension and suspense response in the audience. And so we wanted to know if we could do this with music as well. And so what we did is, the person who led this paper was at Stanford a while back. So we actually joined forces with him for a series of papers that kind of started out as a pilot study that went through my PhD dissertation. And then finally, we got our first major paper in this area out a few years ago. And we are finding that this approach can be applied to music listening as well. And so for today, I thought I would share with you a recent paper that came out of our group. The lead author, Tyson Dower, is actually a musicologist who also does neuroscience work. And we focused on this genre of minimalist music, which is known for being very repetitive. But I thought I would just show you kind of an example of what we got out of this. So again, we have time on the x-axis. The stimulus was about 5 minutes long. And then you can see the y-axis is the correlation. And we have lots of peaks in the correlation. And these dashed vertical lines indicate like when the music content was changing. So I thought I would just play you a little bit of the stimulus, and you can kind of listen for when like instruments come in or come out, or the texture kind of changes. And those are the points at which the audience seemed to get really engaged. So I'll just play a little bit of this. Okay, so hopefully you could kind of hear like things were changing, and that would be, for instance, where the correlation would go way up. And so we've had pretty good success with this method so far. And we've actually done a number of studies with different kinds of music. So we've looked at Bollywood music. We've looked at like various kind of like electronic music. We have a preprint out involving classical music. We have data that's even like on post-rock, if anybody is a fan of that genre. And we're actually launching a new study now that's looking like less at stylistic differences in music and more in performance. So the study we're running now actually has a piano work that's performed very expressively by an expert. And then there's also like a very robotic and mechanical version. So we're seeing like whether expression in performance can also engage listeners in a way that we can measure. So that's kind of the main research that I wanted to present today. I thought I would say a little bit about just interdisciplinary approaches to neuroscience in general. And I would say that for us, the use of techniques that came from engineering actually enables us to ask more interesting questions about music. And so I would encourage all of you to think about like ways to collaborate with people in other fields, or bring in approaches that might really lead to questions that couldn't have been asked otherwise. And so for us, we have people in our collaborator group who have different kinds of expertise, ranging from music to the actual like neuroscience research, but then also data analysis expertise. And now with additional domain expertise with my work in the Graduate School of Education, we're also working with people who are experts in speech processing and also experts in educational neuroscience. And so it's been really exciting to see how these methods might ultimately be applied in new ways through these new collaborations. And where we're going next, so in the Educational Neuroscience Initiative, we are launching a series of new studies right now that involve music and speech. And we're also really trying to get our methodologies, to continue to advance. And we're also working on reusable tools such as software, so that we're kind of working in a niche like approach that's not widely used right now, and we really want to enable other people to use these approaches too. So we want to make the approaches more accessible, which will hopefully increase adoption. And finally, we've gotten part of the way there with ecological validity, so we can now work with real world stimuli. We'd like to get to these real world data collection settings as well. So one thing we're doing is we're starting to work with mobile EEG systems so that we can actually collect data from people who are in a more natural environment than the lab environment. And that brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you again for inviting me, and I hope we still have time to discuss a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we wanted to do a little Q&A at the end, and we have like 4-ish minutes. So does anyone have any questions for Blair? Go ahead.
I might have missed this, but like, what prompted you to pursue research in this field, or why is this field particularly interesting for you?
Can you repeat the last part of the question? Sorry.
What was your journey to pursuing research in this field, and why, and what interested you about this kind of work?
Oh yeah, so that's a great question. So I was not always on the research path, and it was actually kind of an unexpected opportunity that came up when I was working after my undergraduate degree. There was a professor that I was working for that wasn't my work wasn't related to music at all at that time, and he actually had a brain lab and offered to fund my master's studies to do an RA-ship, so to be a research assistant in his lab, which was actually a machine learning lab. And so that's when I went back for the master's, and then that was kind of my first foray into research, and I thought it was so interesting and exciting that I'm still here all these years later.
And then Mia, did you have?
Yeah. Does the same technology work on a child or a minor, and like how would that affect the test results?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I usually work with adults, in part because I'm not really focused on development, although the lab I work in is focused on development. So there would be a few things that would be different with children. So first, depending on where they are developmentally, their brain response might just be different. Like it might implicate different brain areas, or like people might be processing stimuli at a different speed. Another factor is that data from small children especially can tend to be a lot noisier. So if you imagine working with like a 5-year-old and asking them to sit very still and listen to a piece of music for 5 minutes, it's going to be a different kind of data coming out than from an adult. So that would make the data cleaning a little bit more challenging as well.
And then I have one question. So have you looked at like people studying while listening to music? Because like personally, I found that listening to music does not help me focus, but for some people it does. And I'm wondering like if you have EEG data on that kind of subject.
We haven't looked at that yet, but that is definitely on my list of things to look at. And actually, I was looking up literature on it recently, and most of the literature was what you're describing, where it was actually detracting from the studying, or like distracting the person from what they were studying. But I know that it's really effective for a lot of people. And so I think the kind of techniques that we're using, there would actually be ways to set up a study to see whether the presence of music actually makes them engage more with the other thing.
Yeah. And I think it's also interesting to think about like what kind of music, because I've heard somewhere that like video game music is made to like make you concentrate more and like some other like rock, some other genres are like less helpful for studying and focusing.
Yeah, I actually came across some of that too when I was looking into the studying music, and it seems like, based on some feedback I've gotten from people recently, that a lot of people do use video game music when they study.
Yeah, that's super cool. Yeah. All right. Does anyone else have any questions? If not, I think that will be it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone.